We're going to look at a more analytical and structural topic of the brain rather than more of a case study, as I had made the decision to go from more case studies without further previous information about parts of the brain that the case study looks into, rather than just spewing out case studies without knowing parts of the brain in depth, before conceding into research towards it. And so this will probably become a series where I look into parts of the brain, and it will probably, for example, when I looked at the frontal lobe in my last video, I looked at 4 different lobes. For example, if I wanted to look at the occipital lobe specifically, I could make a singular video on that and look at parts of the occipital nerve and how each of them have a specific function maybe. And so I thought that this, because the brain is such a broad topic in terms of roles and structure, maybe I should include the history parts in just maybe as a checkpoint for every few videos. Nonetheless, today we're going to be looking at the amygdala, and despite it being the size of an almond, it plays a massive role in terms of fear. Hence, I put the words "the fear center" right after it. And it plays a massive role in fear, survival, and emotional memory, of course. This part of the brain first became of interest to me when, before my GCSE exams, we had an assembly, and there was a guy that came in and he talked about how our brain goes into a fight or flight response when we're stressing too much, and this doesn't allow us to think more analytically. And so he taught us ways to stimulate it, such as probably going exercising before the exam to, of course, lower cortisol. And nonetheless, I wanted to look more into it. And so here I am 1 year later, approximately, talking about the amygdala. But all that talking about how I got interested into the amygdala, you'd probably want to know what the amygdala is now. It's a almond-shaped part of the brain, and there's 2 of them. So they're deep within the brain, so it would be quite hard to injure. I said I was not going to really talk about case studies as much, but I will add them slightly within my videos. Like, for example, Phineas Gage, that metal rod that got shoved through his head. I'll be talking about him until I make a new case study, and then I'll be able to combine case studies to talk about specific parts of the brain and how they contributed. Nonetheless, I was talking about how Phineas Gage got hit by a metal rod through his head. His amygdala was most likely not affected, as this is quite deep within the brain. But anger management and emotions are also a factor which are contributed to towards by the amygdala. And so it wouldn't be a crazy statement to say that his amygdala was damaged during this injury. So, as I just said, it's involved in emotions, and mostly, especially, but not only, fear and threat detection. So, as I said, fight or flight, that's you detecting a threat and wanting to do something against it. And of course, it works with other brain areas like the hypothalamus and the prefrontal cortex, which means that it isn't a part of the brain that works by itself. It works with multiple parts of the brain, and it is part of the limbic system, which is the emotional center of the brain. And as I said, it is split into 2 parts, each in a hemisphere. And to be honest, it works closest with, as I said, the hypothalamus, but this is more for bodily responses. For memory, it would be the hippocampus, and as I said, the prefrontal cortex, it would be more for decision making. The amygdala is located it's found deeply in the medial temporal lobe, as I had mentioned in the last video, parts of like how the frontal lobe compared, like different parts of it compared with parts of for example, I said the occipital nerve, its size compared to other parts of the frontal lobe as a whole. And This is located in the temporal nerve, the medial, so around the middle, closer to the hippocampus, as you can see on the diagram. It's ideally placed to combine emotional responses from the amygdala and memory storage from the hippocampus. So if you have a more developed hippocampus, you would most likely be better at problem solving, and for not problem solving, you'd be more better at, well, in memory games. Or people with an overdeveloped like a very overdeveloped hippocampus would most likely have photographic memory. You may have heard of this before, where they'd be able to see something and instantly be able to remember everything about that image. Now, this connection is why emotional events, especially scary or stressful ones, stick in your memory more clearly due to where it's placed. Because, for example, your emotional responses from the amygdala is placed right next to the memory storage from the hippocampus. And so, if that gets stimulated, it would trigger such a neurological response, including brain waves, for example, and signals getting sent out so strongly if it's scary that it may trigger, well, the hippocampus to act. And so this is why people get PTSD, for example, because, say, for example, you hear a big bomb explode right next to you or something like this. That would most likely produce a signal in your brain large enough from the amygdala to also trigger your hippocampus. And these visuals often show the amygdala in the brain as it scans this part, like I'm showing the amygdala. It scans like lit up when an emotional thing was happening to the person. Now, how does the amygdala work exactly? I will explain the diagram, but of course, the amygdala is more like a danger radar system. So if your brain receives signals from the senses that you're in danger, it will, of course, feel something like it would send a signal, and it would activate the sympathetic nervous system, which is the fight or flight saying where it comes from, and it would trigger a stress hormone release such as adrenaline, which would give you, of course, which would go straight to your muscles, and cortisol, which would trigger stress. And this would happen very quickly because you wouldn't want to think, like your brain doesn't give you an opportunity to think with your conscious mind that something is happening before it, of course, does. And it evaluates if something is dangerous as well, most likely before you get to decide whether it's dangerous or not. However, if you're able to control this part of the brain more, you would be able to decide your own. Well, for example, let me give an example of this. It is easier to understand with examples. Some people that go on stage, they would be thinking, oh, what is everyone thinking of me? You could either interpret that as a dangerous signal or something that isn't dangerous. That's taking control of your own amygdala. And this would also in turn provide you with whether or not you want to provide yourself the signals to prepare for action, which is fight or flight, the sympathetic nervous system, which would trigger stress hormones. And so you would have excess energy and cortisol in your body, adrenaline and cortisol in your body. Now, the diagram. So, overall, a sensory thalamus. So, the emotional stimulus is detected. Something emotionally relevant happens, such as a loud noise, for example, or something like that. And the stimulus is picked up by your sensory organs, such as the eyes, fingertips, most likely, or your ears. And this signal gets sent to your brainstem and then the sensory hypothalamus, as you can see. Now, the sensory thalamus relays the signal. So it acts as a relay station. It sends the signal directly to the amygdala for a fast instinctive response. So this is called the low road response because it sends it directly to the amygdala for an instinctive response, the first initial response that you're going to have. And then for the high road response, it goes all the way up to the cerebral cortex for more detailed analysis on your situation. So this is the part it gets quite confusing. So as I said, the sensory thalamus, as I mentioned above, before. It gets sent to the brainstem, then the sensory thalamus. And then the sensory thalamus acts as a relay station. So this just relays the signals which way it wants to, of course, deal with this situation based on the structures on your brain. So low road is the instinctive response, the instant response. So say if you stubbed your toe or something, you're gonna instantly say ouch or something. And then the detailed analysis, that throbbing pain you get after stubbing your toe, your brain, of course, rushing to send signals to that area after to find out what's wrong or if the area is damaged. And the instinctive one's the low road, the more detailed one is the high road. And thirdly, of course, the cerebral cortex analyzes the information. This is the high road, more detailed into the high road, as you could think about it. So the primary sensory cortex, I'll go into the cerebral cortex in another video. For now, it will just be a term I use a lot of. It is just a part of the brain. It processes the raw input, such as a visual or auditory input. And a unimodal association area refines this information for a single sense focus. Now, uni meaning a single association area, so it refines this information that the cerebral cortex gets initially. So this is the more of a singular type of thing. And the polymodal association areas integrate multiple senses for a full context of this full analysis. So the initial part of the high road analysis, which is the detailed analysis, it can get answered with a unimodal association, which I'm going over this again because it is quite confusing. And this refines it. So it refines the information, maybe gives a single little action, like ouch, for example, after stubbing your toe. And the polymodal association areas integrate multiple senses, like, for example, senses for full context of this, for example, injury or signal. And then after all of this processed input is then sent to the amygdala. The amygdala then compares incoming signals with past experiences. It communicates with the hippocampal formation to add context and memory to the emotional situation. Because as you know, the amygdala is for fear, and the hippocampus, as I said, it would be for memory. So it locating the hippocampus to communicate with it would add more context to the situation, as it would have if they had experienced this type of pain before, and it could in turn calm the body down. Or for example, say if they have a primary immune response to it, the body could for example, release memory cells for this, of course, or something like this. And if a threat is detected, it coordinates a rapid response. So if this has happened before, if the hippocampus recalls this and communicates to the amygdala this specific memorization factor, then it would coordinate a more rapid response, like a positive correlation, of course. And then, of course, the last step, the amygdala would trigger an emotional response. The amygdala would send signals to other brain regions to produce emotional behaviors, autonomic behaviors such as increased heart rate and pupil dilation, and endocrine responses such as hormonal release. And yeah, that is basically how the amygdala works. In a summary, it's just step one. If you want to think about it in steps, the emotional stimulus is detected. That's it. The signal is sent. You touched it, the signal is sent. Then the sensory hypothalamus relays the signal, so sends it out to separate parts. The cerebral cortex, analyzes the information, the high road, and also some signals are sent directly to the amygdala by the sensory hypothalamus for an instinctive response. Now, after the cortex has analyzed the information during the high road period, the amygdala would be able to analyze the situation and evaluates it, and it would work with the hippocampus to do this. And then, in turn, the amygdala triggers emotional responses such as emotional, autonomic, or endocrinal. Now, you heard me talking about different pathways about the slow road and high road. Let me go more into it for you. So, this is called Ledoux's model. and I may be butchering his name, but that's how I always said his name. He's a neuroscientist who prepared two FIA circuits. So these are called circuits. So the low road circuit is just from the thalamus, the hypothalamus, to the amygdala, and it's about 12 milliseconds. It allows for instant reactions to danger, such as, say, if you get jumped out of fear, then that's your instinctive response, instant response. So flinching as well is also a low road pathway. And then the high road pathway, keep in mind that the low road was hypothalamus to amygdala. That's it. The high road, this is assuming we're already talking about within the brain. It would be the hypothalamus, then cerebral cortex for analyzation, then the amygdala. This is slightly slower at 30 to 50 milliseconds, depending on factors such as age, sex, and, for example, other things. But this lets the brain analyze the context and adjust the emotional response to this context after, of course, flinching and etc. The amygdala would use both pathways to balance speed and accuracy of risk response, and that's why we sometimes flinch at things that aren't real threats, as the brain's pathway would think it's better to be safe than to had let something happen without us, of course, being able to deal with it effectively. And it helps us like react quickly. So the flinch, you'd maybe put up your hand up, it would protect you maybe, but it would also refine our response after. So say if it wasn't actually a threat and we flinched for no reason, that wouldn't be a problem because it didn't take a lot of energy to do so. Now, I've been talking about hormones such as, for example, if I go back 2 slides, I talked about, for example, cortisol and adrenaline. Now we can go more into detail about this in terms of the fear response, as there is more to go into it than the sympathetic nervous system, which is more of a fast reaction. So say if you have adrenaline pumped into your heart rate would increase. Or if you have adrenaline pumped within your bloodstream, you would have increased, like your sweat glands would obviously increase in producing sweat. But now here we come across the HPA axis activation. Now, this is less immediate, but the thing is, we need to first understand that the amygdala isn't for fight or flight only. That's a common misconception. As I've been talking about, the whole video has been fight or flight, fight or flight, fight or flight. Now, it controls like bodily changes such as hormones as well. You'd normally think that it would be the thyroid gland that would do this mostly. This is more of just the thing that releases most of the hormone, like thyroxine, for example. But to be honest, the HPA axis, it's more for cortisol. So the sympathetic nervous system is for things such as heart rate or sweat, which adrenaline does. But if you activate the HPA axis, it would be the pathway it would take would be the amygdala, then the hypothalamus, then the pituitary gland, which would then stimulate the adrenal glands, and then the adrenal glands would release cortisol. So let me repeat this. The amygdala contributes to stimulation of the hypothalamus, which triggers the pituitary gland, and then the adrenal glands are triggered by the pituitary glands to release cortisol, not adrenaline. And cortisol does help the body deal with stress, and it also strengthens emotional memory formation. And these hormones help us survive danger, but if it's activated too often, hence people sometimes talk negatively about cortisol, it can lead to chronic stress, as your body would always be looking for that type of comfort from this hormone. Now, from this diagram I've only been slightly talking about it. This is more of the stress response. So step 1 would probably be the stress identification. The brain detects a stressor, something that's stressing you, and the hypothalamus initiates a stress response. This would activate the pituitary gland. This, by the way, this is only after the amygdala has been, stimulated. Nevertheless, the hypothalamus stimulates pituitary gland to release, of course, ACTH, as you can see at the top. And this hormone would, as you can see at the top, I never really know how to pronounce this, adrenocorticotropic hormone. You won't really need to know much about the name, it's just more of a stimulus for the adrenal gland stimulation, as the ACTH travels through the bloodstream to the adrenal glands to, of course, stimulate it. And then the adrenal glands would stimulate hormones such as adrenaline and cortisol to be released based on what is actually being activated, so the sympathetic nervous system or the HPA axis. And for example, cortisol would increase the level of glucose in the bloodstream for more energy to be away from stress. And adrenaline would be the fight or flight response hormone. Now, you can see a very distressed man on our right here. But this is as a result of damage to the actual amygdala or a malfunction to the amygdala, because it can either become overactive or underactive, which can cause problems. For example, an overreactive amygdala, which is seen in PTSD, panic disorder, or generalized anxiety. So these are just examples. This is most likely what this man on our right of our screen here is facing, because you can see he's not very emotionless. He has a lot of emotion, as you can see from his facial expressions, which is most likely triggered by, if we go back, you can see exactly what it would be triggered by. Oh, sorry. It would be triggered as a low road response, because his face, as soon as he would see it, in a matter of milliseconds, 12, 15, it would be triggered instantly, his face. If he's probably looking at something, let's keep in mind he's probably looking at something petrifying right now. So even for example, he's seeing something petrifying in his head or something that shouldn't be petrifying if it's an overactive amygdala. So even in safe situations, you wouldn't really feel comforted. You'd still feel terrified. And it's often accompanied by a reduced prefrontal cortex activity, so regulation is impaired. And from our last video, we talked about the prefrontal cortex. If the prefrontal cortex activity is reduced and the amygdala is overreactive, this would all pair together to form a very emotional person. Nonetheless, an underactive amygdala is seen in very rare conditions, actually. But for people with damage may not feel fear. Say if someone, some people that have an underactive amygdala would not be able to feel certain fears, such as, say, if they're on the brink of death, they wouldn't really be fearful. So understanding this would help scientists design better treatments for emotional disorders. And this is important because if you just say that the amygdala malfunctions, you do not know which one it is, and they'll most likely be able to detect this via, for example, equipment such as an MRI scan, or you can see how developed that part of the brain is, or you can do a brain scan and then see how much waves are let off of the amygdala. If it's smaller than average or more than average, you'd be able to tell whether it's over average, is it overactive, or it's underactive because it's under the average brain waves being emitted. Now, let's see why the amygdala matters. So you've heard all of this. So the amygdala helps you, first of all, recognize danger, respond to fear, and remember your emotional experiences to be more careful next time, in, of course, coordination with the hippocampus. Essential to survival, but also understanding emotional health, and dysfunctions in this small region are most likely linked to anxiety, depression, PTSD, or even risk-taking behaviors. And this is why I'm so fascinated about it, because this part of the brain contributes to something that is not actually physical. It's just waves that contribute to all of this. Nonetheless, thank you for watching this video. If you would like to connect, please comment down below what you would like to see next. I did say I was going to do less case studies, but if you would like to see a case study, just let me know and I'll plan it for a future video. And thank you very much for watching. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed. Goodbye.